trying to help your God. If he is a god, let him protect himself." Because he said this, the people did not kill Gideon. Then the Midianites came again to steal from the Israelites. There were so many of them that they could not be counted. Gideon called the Israelites together to fight them. Gideon asked God for 2 signs so he could be sure that God would use him to save Israel. Only on the sheepskin and not on the ground. God did that. The next night, he asked that the ground be wet, but the sheepskin dry. God did that too. These 2 signs convinced Gideon that God would use him to save Israel from the Midianites. 32,000 Israelite soldiers came to Gideon, but God told him this was too many. So Gideon sent home 22,000 who were afraid to fight. God told Gideon that he still had too many men. So Gideon sent all of them home except for 300 soldiers. That night God told Gideon, "Go down to the Midianite camp, and when you hear what they say, you will no longer be afraid." So that night Gideon went down to the camp and heard a Midianite soldier telling his friend about something he had dreamed. The man's friend said, "This dream means that Gideon's army will defeat the Midianite army." When Gideon heard this, he worshipped God. Then Gideon returned to his soldiers and gave each of them a horn, a clay pot, and a torch. They surrounded the camp where the Midianite soldiers were sleeping. Gideon's 300 soldiers had the torches in the pots, so the Midianites could not see the light of the torches. Then all of Gideon's soldiers broke their pots at the same moment, suddenly revealing the fire of the torches. They blew their horns and shouted, "A sword for Yahweh and for Gideon." God confused the Midianites so that they started attacking and killing each other. Immediately the rest of the Israelites were called from their homes to come help chase the Midianites. They killed many of them and chased the rest of them out of the Israelites' land. 120,000 Midianites died that day. God had saved Israel. The people wanted to make Gideon their king. Gideon did not allow them to do this, but he asked them for some of the gold rings that each of them had taken from the Midianites. The people gave Gideon a large amount of gold. Then Gideon used the gold to make a special garment, like the high priest used to wear. But the people started worshiping it as if it were an idol. So God punished Israel again because they worshipped idols. God allowed their enemies to defeat them. They finally asked God for help again, and God sent them another deliverer. This pattern repeated many times. The Israelites would sin, God would punish them, they would repent, and God would send a deliverer to save them. Over many years, God sent many deliverers who saved the Israelites from their enemies. Finally, the people asked God for a king like all the other nations had. They wanted a king who was tall and strong and who could lead them into battle. God did not like this request, but he gave them a king just as they had asked.
We'd love to have your opinion on these programs and to find out how well they are coming in. Email feedback to KTWR@twr.org.
Story number 17, God's covenant with David. Saul was the first king of Israel. He was tall and handsome, just like the people wanted. Saul was a good king for the first few years that he ruled over Israel. But then he became a wicked man who did not obey God. So God chose a different man who would one day be king in his place. God chose a young Israelite named David to be king after Saul. David was a shepherd from the town of Bethlehem. At different times, while he was watching his father's sheep, David had killed both a lion and a bear that had attacked the sheep. David was a humble and righteous man who trusted and obeyed God. David became a great soldier and leader. When David was still a young man, he fought against a giant named Goliath. Goliath was a trained soldier, very strong, and almost 3 meters tall. But God helped David kill Goliath and save Israel. After that, David won many victories over Israel's enemies, for which the people praised him. Saul became jealous of the people's love for David. Saul tried many times to kill him, so David hid from Saul. One day Saul was looking for David so he could kill him. Saul went into the same cave where David was hiding from Saul, but Saul did not see him. David was now very close to Saul and could have killed him, but he did not. Instead, David cut off a piece of Saul's clothes to prove to Saul that he would not kill him in order to become king. Eventually, Saul died in battle, and David became king of Israel. He was a good king, and the people loved him. God blessed David and made him successful. David fought many battles, and God helped him defeat Israel's enemies. David conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital city. During David's reign, Israel became powerful and wealthy. David wanted to build a temple where all the Israelites could worship God and offer him sacrifices. For about 400 years, the people had been worshiping God and offering sacrifices to him at the tent of meeting that Moses had built. But God sent the prophet Nathan to David with this message: "Because you are a man of war, you will not build this temple for me. Your son will build it, but I will bless you greatly. One of your descendants will rule as king over my people forever." The only descendant of David who could rule forever was the Messiah. The Messiah was God's chosen one, who would save the people of the world from their sin. When David heard these words, he immediately thanked and praised God because he had promised David this great honor and many blessings. David did not know when God would do these things, but as it happened, the Israelites would have to wait a long time before the Messiah came, almost 1,000 years. David ruled with justice and faithfulness for many years, and God blessed him. However, toward the end of his life, he sinned terribly against God. One day, when all of David's soldiers were away from home fighting battles, he looked out from his palace and saw a beautiful woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. Instead of looking away, David sent someone to bring her to him. He slept with her and sent her back home. A short time later, Bathsheba sent a message to David saying that she was pregnant. Bathsheba's husband, a man named Uriah, was one of David's best soldiers. David called Uriah back from the battle and told him to go be with his wife. But Uriah refused to go home while the rest of the soldiers were in battle. So David sent Uriah back to the battle and told the general to place him where the enemy was strongest, so that he would be killed. After Uriah was killed, David married Bathsheba. Later she gave birth to David's son. God was very angry about what David had done, so he sent the prophet Nathan to tell David how evil his sin was. David repented of his sin, and God forgave him. For the rest of his life, David followed and obeyed God, even in difficult times. But as punishment for David's sin, his baby boy died. There was also fighting in David's family for the rest of his life, and David's power was greatly weakened. Though David had been unfaithful to God, God was still faithful to his promises. Later, David and Bathsheba had another son, and they named him Solomon.
We'd love to have your opinion on these programs and to find out how well they are coming in. Email feedback to KTWR DRM at twr.org.
Story number 19, the prophets. Throughout the history of the Israelites, God sent them prophets. The prophets heard messages from God. and then told the people God's messages. Elijah was a prophet when Ahab was king over the kingdom of Israel. Ahab was an evil man who encouraged people to worship a false god named Baal. Elijah said to Ahab, "There will be no rain or dew in the kingdom of Israel until I say so." This made Ahab very angry. God told Elijah to go to a stream in the wilderness to hide from Ahab, who wanted to kill him. Every morning and every evening, birds would bring him bread and meat. Ahab and his army looked for Elijah, but they could not find him. The drought was so severe that the stream eventually dried up. So Elijah went to a neighboring country. A widow and her son in that country had almost run out of food because the lack of rain had caused a famine. But they took care of Elijah, and God provided for them so that their flour jar and their bottle of oil never became empty. They had food through the whole famine. Elijah stayed there for several years. After 3.5 years, God told Elijah to return to the kingdom of Israel and speak with Ahab because he was going to send rain again. When Ahab saw Elijah, he said, "There you are, you troublemaker." Elijah replied to him, "You are the troublemaker. You have abandoned Yahweh, the true God, and worshiped Baal. Bring all of the people of the kingdom of Israel to Mount Carmel." All the people of the kingdom of Israel, including the 450 prophets of Baal, came to Mount Carmel. Elijah said to the people, "How long will you keep changing your mind? If Yahweh is God, serve him. If Baal is God, serve him." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Kill a bull and prepare it as a sacrifice, but do not light the fire. I will do the same. The God who answers with fire is the real God." So the priests of Baal prepared a sacrifice but did not light the fire. Then the prophets of Baal prayed to Baal, "Hear us, Baal." All day long they prayed and shouted and even cut themselves with knives, but there was no answer. At the end of the day, Elijah prepared a sacrifice to God. Then he told the people to pour 12 huge pots of water on top of the sacrifice until the meat, the wood, and even the ground around the altar were completely wet. Then Elijah prayed, "Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, show us today that you are the God of Israel and that I am your servant. Answer me so that these people will know that you are the true God." Immediately, fire fell from the sky and burned up the meat, the wood, the rocks, the dirt, and even the water that was around the altar. When the people saw this, they fell on the ground and said, "Yahweh is God. Yahweh is God." Then Elijah said, "Do not let any of the prophets of Baal escape." So the people captured the prophets of Baal and took them away from there and killed them. Then Elijah said to King Ahab, "Return immediately to the city, because the rain is coming." Soon the sky grew black, and a heavy rain began. Yahweh had ended the drought and proved that he is the true God. After the time of Elijah, God chose a man named Elisha to be his prophet. God did many miracles through Elisha. One of the miracles happened to Naaman, an enemy commander who had a horrible skin disease. He had heard of Elisha, so he went and asked Elisha to heal him. Elisha told Naaman to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. At first, Naaman was angry and would not do it because it seemed foolish. But later he changed his mind and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River. When he came up the last time, his skin was completely healed. God had healed him. God sent many other prophets. They all told the people to stop worshiping idols and to start showing justice and mercy to others. The prophets warned the people that if they did not stop doing evil and start obeying God, then God would judge them as guilty and he would punish them. Most of the time, the people did not obey God. They often mistreated the prophets and sometimes even killed them. Once, the prophet Jeremiah was put into a dry well and left there to die. He sank down into the mud that was in the bottom of the well. But then the king had mercy on him and ordered his servants to pull Jeremiah out of the well before he died. The prophets continued to speak for God even though the people hated them. They warned people that God would destroy them if they did not repent. They also reminded people of the promise that God's Messiah would come.
We'd love to have your opinion on these programs and to find out how well they are coming in. Email feedback to KTWR DRM at twr.org.
Designer of eternity, the maker of the sky and sea, He is, and through Him all things came to be, the one whose breath gave life to me, creator of the galaxies He is. Jesus is